All right. Well, we are on the live stream and we're live here in person. So we're just twice alive, I guess. I don't know. It's felt like Monday all day to me, so I don't know what y'all are in for today. Let's turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. At least know where we're going to start. And we're going to finish up chapter 7 and head into chapter 8 here. And to get us going, we're going to be Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And let's start at verse 23. That sort of begins this last section. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, we're going to start in verse 23. All this I tested by wisdom, and I said, I am determined to be wise, but this was beyond me. Whatever exists is far off and profound. Who can discover it? So I turned my mind to understand, to investigate, and to search out wisdom and the scheme of things, and to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. All right, this actually sort of sets the stage for the next little section. And if you notice, he says, there are some things we just don't understand. All right, that's basically how he begins this, that he wanted to understand everything, but some things are just beyond us all. Okay? But he wanted to understand it, and particularly right there in verse 26, or 25, to understand the stupidity of wickedness and the madness of folly. That's the context for the next little few verses. And if we don't get that, we may misinterpret what he's about to say. So let's look at what he says. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will snare. I always have to be careful when I get to this part. I don't know why. Could be because my wife is sitting back there on the computer and she can cut me off in a heartbeat. One thing when it talks about women, especially in the Old Testament, that we have to keep in mind is that their culture was very different than ours. And not necessarily in a better way. Actually, not in a better way. Through most of Old Testament times, women didn't have much more rights than slaves. All right? They were considered basically the possessions of their husbands. Marriages were arranged. They had no say in who they married. Of course, neither did the guy necessarily, though that could be a little different. And men, by and large, had little to no interaction with women not in their own household. In the Middle East especially, that was really the case. Still the case to this day in some areas. So you have to take that into context when he starts talking about, like this, about the bitter woman being a snare. What he's talking about is actually probably somebody who's immoral. It's not just about attitude. It's about that kind of interaction. All right? And that's why he says the man of God will avoid her or will escape from her. Solomon actually had a lot of experience in that, didn't he? How many wives did he have? Yeah, enough he probably did not even know all their names, or even close to knowing all their names. In fact, there were some of them he may have never even met, except for the day they were presented to him, because a lot of them were the daughters of kings and city-state rulers and all of that, who were given to Solomon as part of a treaty, or to try to make good with the most powerful king in the world. But his wives also were his downfall. They were the ones who brought idolatry into Israel. And it would take centuries for that to... actually, they wouldn't get over that till the Babylonian exile. Till Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. And then they went through the exile. And by the time Jesus is around, there's no more idolatry. But you read the Old Testament, it is a constant struggle. And a lot of that goes back to Solomon and all of his wives, because most of them were not Jewish. They were coming from other countries, other religions, other cultures. So keep that in mind when you read stuff like this. This is not a blanket statement about women. Neither is the one we're about to read. So let's just keep going. Verse 27. Look, says the teacher, this is what I have discovered. Adding one thing to another to discover the scheme of things. While I was still searching, but not finding, I found one upright man among 1,000, but not one upright woman among them all. This only have I found. God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. I'm told this is Marvin's favorite verse. I'll let Eileen deal with that. What do you think he means by one man in 1,000 and not a single woman? Are men more righteous than women? Be very careful how you respond, men. Yeah, very, very little difference here. Most of us who work in churches can tell you women always outnumber men in church. That's just a blanket fact, and it's been that way for a long, long time. So, again, take into account the context of where Solomon is coming from. Because he's also looking from a very worldly view. Remember, that's the whole perspective of Ecclesiastes. It's life without hope. It's pointlessness. It's life in the world. And that sort of gives you the idea that he's not trying to make a judgment call on who's more righteous, men or women. In fact, if he is, he's basically saying neither. Like Perry said, 1 in 1,000, 0 in 1,000. I'm not betting on either one of those odds. Nowhere close. So it's more his view of how messed up the world is. Now, really the more important part of this, we get hung up in that verse. The more important part's the last part, where he said there, let me get my eyes back on. Verse 29, this only have I found, God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. This is actually a very important concept. You know, as he looks at of men and women, of those relationships, of business and success and all of that, and he says repeatedly, it's all pointless. He gives us this little summary statement. He said, God made us good. We've gone astray. Now, that's important for a couple reasons. One, it really lets us know where the blame lies, and it's not with God. All right? It also lets us know that our unrighteousness is the product of our own actions. Now, this is a bigger argument philosophically, I guess, but between different Christian groups, because there is the idea that we are born sinners. We are born incapable of being righteous. There are a few verses that point that direction. All right? We're not going to say they're not. I think most of them, like the one in Psalms, particularly where David says, I've been a sinner from birth. I don't know that David's trying to be literal. I think he's saying, I'm a terrible person and I don't like who I am. And Psalms are full of poetic language. There are just as many passages, if not more in my opinion, like this, that says, no, we're created one way, we choose to be another. In fact, in Romans, where it talks about all sin, or that death spread through sin to all mankind because everybody sinned. And that goes to each and every one of us. To me, it's actually a dangerous idea to try to take responsibility for our condition away from us. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a part that I have no control over. I managed to get myself unrighteous, but I cannot make myself righteous. That's actually where the barrier comes in, you know, where we lose all ability.
We might wonder why he was searching in the first place. So in verse 29, he said, men have gone and searched for many schemes.
Yeah.
It's like it's somebody else. But the verse before he said, well, I was still searching and not finding. He's in that group.
Absolutely.
The whole deal
And when you take this into context, to go with what Perry just said, he's searching, he's looking, he wants to understand everything. But in this part we just read, he does say repeatedly, I'm still looking, but I'm not finding these answers that I want to find. In fact, he doesn't really give us an answer till we get to the end of the book. And y'all remember what that is. The whole matter concludes, fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man. When everything is boiled down, everything else we get into, relationships, business, the projects, the things we try to accomplish, the schemes that mankind is constantly in, none of that means anything outside of fear God and keep His commandments. Oh, absolutely. Well, how many people are searching for meaning in life today, and they're going after these schemes? What's life really about? What does success look like? That's big in our culture. How can I be successful? Scroll through Facebook, watch YouTube, do anything on social media, and you're going to see 1,000 advertisements telling you what you need to have, do, or make to be successful. And if you do that, you'll be happy. The problem is, no, you won't. That's the nature of things. We think these schemes, these other ideas can fulfill us, but they never have been able to. Another thing that he's already said in this, and Proverbs says it as well, is there is nothing new under the sun. We feel different. I've got a computer in my pocket. We call it a phone, but it really is a computer. We drive vehicles. I watched SpaceX. I watched a video the other day of them landing their boosters, and it looked like something out of War of the Worlds. You see this pencil come down with fire out of the bottom of it, and it lands upright on the pad. I'm like, that was science fiction when I was a kid. All those toys and technology is cool, but it did not change who we are. Humanity is the same today as we have always been. And that's why Ecclesiastes is really so profound of a book. As he's describing this, he's still describing us 3,000 years later. It really makes no difference.
When we look at how far the human race has come, the technology you just mentioned, what was only a dream way back then is actually happening now. And probably 20 years from now, what we're doing now is going to be nothing. It's going to be that much. It'll keep on going further and further. But where we started in verse 23, I think Solomon's saying that he did have wisdom. He was wise. But yet he couldn't get close to figuring out all the things he was wanting to figure out. And that just shows the difference between man and God.
Yes.
And Solomon is bringing that out and saying God's way up here, and as much and as smart and everything we're going to be able to figure out, there's still going to be this huge gap. And then he comes to the conclusion that we'll find at the end of this book. But he's slowly, it's all building up to that, what he says at the end.
Yeah.
Because even him being the smartest one and had everything that he wanted and all that he desired, it wasn't even close to what God.
It still left him empty and confused. I guess for those online, I'll try to repeat the summary. Solomon, being the wisest man in the world, trying to understand it all, still couldn't. Only God truly grasps the whole scope of things. That's why we have to trust Him. That's why our duty at the end, when the book has finally finished, is to fear God and keep His commandments. He knows how to do it. Even the wisest and smartest among us don't. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to understand. That doesn't mean that we can't progress, so to speak, at least technologically. I would love to see humanity make it to Mars in my lifetime. I wasn't born when we walked on the moon. I'd love to see a milestone like that. What would it accomplish? Well, we'd walk on Mars. That would be sort of cool. Would it change who we are fundamentally? Not even close. You transplant humanity to Mars, You still got humanity, just slightly more red tinted, I guess. I don't know. The only thing that can change us is God, because He's the one who created us. Our creations can't do that, regardless of how incredible they may seem at times.
And I think that's when our wisdom increases, when we follow God, when we can see the way God sees. Not see exactly like Him, but in some short way have a perspective of the way He sees things. When we treat people the way He wants us to, I think that's when our wisdom elevates.
Absolutely. In fact, if you go over to the book of James, when it talks about the two different kinds of wisdoms, godly wisdom, which is seeing things more or less from God's perspective. Like you said, we never have His full vision. We never understand it the way He does, but He does give us His perspective. That is actually a definition for wisdom, to see things God's way. And it's neat because He tells us as Christians, that's a gift He simply gives. The only way you get it is to ask Him for it. You don't get it through life. You don't get it through experience. You don't get it through your own intellectual endeavors. That's actually what James calls demonic wisdom. Because our experiences, our own intelligence, our own whatever, tends to lead us the wrong direction. Godly wisdom is simply given, which is a mystery. It's profound. And it's honestly a little confusing how God does that. But that's exactly what He says. If you want His wisdom to understand the world His way, the only way you get it is to ask Him.
That's what Solomon did.
Initially, that is what Solomon did.
He was given a huge portion.
Yep.
Then after that, he was thinking about things so much, I think he didn't concentrate on wisdom.
Yeah.
He got back off.
Or he shifted which wisdom he was pursuing. You know, that's quite possible. Because when your wisdom goes in pursuit of power and wealth and influence and all these things, is it still godly wisdom? Or have you shifted to the other kind? And I think Solomon actually had a whole lot of both. But at some points the godly dominated. Some points he chased the wrong kind. Because in his wisdom he said he even chased drunkenness. You know, to understand drunkenness. I'm like, well, Solomon, how hard do you have to try? But it's sort of like the old philosopher's question. Do I exist? When you start asking that question, you've gotten way too far down that road. You know, there are certain questions that are for God and God alone. And He says we do exist, so that's an easy one. I don't mind answering that one. All right, well, let's keep going, because chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8 actually goes with this. So he says, who is like the wise, and who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes its hard appearance. So his end to this, which Proverbs are wisdom literature, they're meant to give you wisdom. He says, look, when you find wisdom, it makes your life better. Understanding how things are supposed to work always makes life better, right? It's very intimidating to be in a situation and we don't understand what's going on. Wisdom is when we do understand what's going on. It's not knowledge, it's understanding, and those are two very different things. Before we shift to the next topic, any other thoughts or comments? We good? All right, we'll look down chapter 8, verse 2. Obey the king's command, I say, because you took an oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave the king's presence. Do not stand up for a bad cause, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since the king's word is supreme, who can say to him, what are you doing? Whoever obeys his command will come to no harm, and the wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every matter, though a person may be weighted down by misery. Since no one knows the future, who can tell someone else what is to come? And no one has power over the wind to contain it. So no one has power over the time of their death. And no one is discharged in time of war. So wickedness will not release those who practice it. All right, let's pause here, because this is think it's a pretty important passage for today. Here's a question. Do we have kings today in America? This is not a trick question. You all had civics in high school, right? No, we don't, right? We're a democracy. We elect our leaders. So it would be very easy to read a passage like this and say, well, this doesn't apply to us today. Actually, it still does. Because we still have those in power, don't we? Those who, we have the ability to elect who we want to put up there, and I guess to recall if we really don't like them or whatever. But while they sit in power, they wield the power, actually. That was something that was hard for me to understand when I was younger. Like, how could a senator, for example, do something that the majority of his constituents didn't necessarily want him to do? Or he voted for something they didn't want him to, or voted against something he wanted them to. But actually, in our government, that's the way it's designed. We elect the person, but once the person's there, the person holds the power. Otherwise, we'd have to have an election for everything, and we don't do that. And the person is expected to follow their conscience in that process. So, I said all that to say this. Those in Washington who sit in power fit the mold of the king in this passage. They're the one who exercise authority in our country from day to day. Here's the thing. As God's people, are we supposed to obey them? I heard Johnny. He said yes. Yeah, we do, actually. Even Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We're told multiple times through Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, we are to obey the king. Well, in our society, our king is our government as a whole. Now, there are exceptions to that, aren't there? When is it not right for us to obey the powers that be? Yeah, when it's contrary to God's word. You know, if they were to tell us, like Rome tried to do, start sacrificing the idols and deny your God. Well, guess what? I will become public enemy number one because I'm not going to stop. If they demand us in some way to violate God's will for us, then we have an obligation first to God. Paul is a great example of that. Paul made full use of his political position while at the same time being very clear that he answered to somebody higher. That's why when he was talking to the different kings as he was going through his multiple trials, making his way to Caesar, he would say, if I have done something worthy of death, go ahead and put me to death. Because if what I have done in preaching Jesus, in spreading the gospel, is a crime, then I'm guilty and I'm not stopping. So, execute me. He was willing to take even the punishment of a corrupt government. But he was not willing to openly rebel against the government at the same time. In fact, the whole way he got to Caesar was he took advantage of his political position as a Roman citizen. As a Roman citizen, you had the right, if you were accused of something, to appeal your case to Caesar himself. And as a Roman citizen, Caesar got to decide, were you innocent, were you guilty? And that's how Paul ended up in Rome. Because when an accusation was made that actually the powers that be knew was false. They weren't even necessarily going to charge him, but Paul had already said, I appealed to Caesar, and they said, well, you appealed to Caesar he goes. That was just the way it worked. I think this is hard for us today because within our culture, rebellion against power is normally seen in general, or can be seen in general, as a positive thing. That's how you affect change in one way in our society. So to rebel against power, we don't necessarily, like, say, a kingdom would say, ooh, wait, no, you can't rebel against the king. That's treason. The cost for treason is always the same, death. In a democracy, our power structure is not quite as clear, so it's easy for us to get this idea, I don't have to listen to them. But I really think, because of passages like this, yeah, we do. Even if we don't like it. Imagine yourself in a kingdom right now. And the king issues a decree. Nobody will eat supper before 8 p.m. I like to eat about 5:30, so I would not like that. I want to eat early and be done with it. King, being king, has the power to say whatever in the world he wants to say. What would we do? Drive across the time zone? Move right on the border. Go across, eat, come back. Yeah. Does that violate anything God has commanded us to do? No. So guess what? As Christians, we'd be expected to comply. In fact, one of the greatest defenses Christians had in the early church was the fact that when all these accusations were made against them, the powers that be on the local level said, we have a problem. We understand we're supposed to persecute them, but they're actually really good citizens. Except for sacrificing to Caesar, they follow all the rules. They don't cause any problem. They never rebel. I think it was Pliny. I probably just had the wrong name. It was one of the Roman governors sent a letter back to the emperor at the time saying, I don't know what to do with these people. The truth is they're really good citizens, but we've been told to persecute them. And the emperor actually writes back at that point, if no charges are made, he actually instituted the first recorded don't ask, don't tell. He goes, don't go out openly pursuing them. If it's made known they're Christian, then it's policy, they're enemies of the empire, you have to deal with them. But because they're actually good citizens and they're not causing a stink, just leave them alone. And that was 2,000 years ago. And that was Christians living in a society that did want to stamp out their faith. Yet they were still good citizens. What do y'all think? I said my piece. Now it's y'all's turn. I'll try to interpret for those at home. It's hard when we're told to do something we don't want to do, isn't it? Y'all remember when the seatbelt law passed? I'm old enough to remember this. Did anybody like that law? I don't remember anybody who did. Chubb's still not used to it. Noah makes fun of me because I'm at least to the end of my driveway before I'm like, oh yeah, hold on. Okay, here we go. Because my boys get in, they just buckle immediately. That's been their whole life. Me, there's still a little part back there. I remember riding, going on vacation or to see family. Me and my brothers would fight, and I was the oldest, so I usually won. Winner got the seat to lay down in. The next level up got to lay in the back window, and the loser had to lay across the hump, which is usually the youngest brother. He got the hump. My goodness, now if a cop pulled somebody over and their kids were laid out like that, they just arrest the parents. But it was, my grandmother had a old station wagon. Do you remember the station wagons that actually had the seat that faced backwards? There were no seat belts on that seat. It was awkward because you had to stare at the people following you. We would always just lay grandma's seat down and we just lay in the back. It was a different world. So when the seatbelt law came in, people hated it. But I remember a preacher back then going, it's the law, do it. Of course, some people yelled at him for saying that. But this is the thing. As Christians, I want to be very careful. This is being recorded and sent out into the world. I am an American second. I am a Christian first. which means the laws this country passes, as long as they don't interfere with me being a Christian, so be it. Now, because I'm an American, I have the right to petition my lawmakers. I have the right to vote. I have the right to do that stuff, and that's great. I do it all. But it's not my top concern. And never will be. Because, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
No, I probably shouldn't. Go ahead.
I'm trying to say,
Save me, please.
I think about the verse that Paul says that, there's a lot of things that are permissible, but they're not necessarily beneficial.
Yeah.
And the reason that comes to my mind, and I know you're going around it a lot, and you don't want to say it, but we're in a perfect example right now with these things.
Yep.
You know,
I was just waiting for somebody else to say it. That way I wasn't the one to bring it up.
and I wasn't gonna say it, but anyway, here's where the wisdom is very important, and not to say that we have it, because we're like Solomon. As much as we have, we still lack a lot. But we try to see things the way God wants us to see them. And this is a perfect example of where just because it's permissible, and being an American gives me a lot of freedoms,
It does.
but sometimes they're not beneficial.
True.
And our goal, the reason, what we're supposed to be doing is trying to bring people to God through word and through action. And sometimes our action, or not sometimes, all the time, our action speaks way louder than our words.
Absolutely.
And so these little things that yeah, it's allowable for me to do. I can refuse to obey the government and not wear my seatbelt. I'll use that one.
There you go.
Or any of these other things. I can refuse that because I'm an American and I got my freedoms. But in God's eyes, if they're not bringing Him glory, and they're not, and that's a hard thing for us to do as humans and as American humans, to always put God first, because we love our freedoms. We love being able to decide.
Freedom is our most valued virtue in the West.
And it makes us feel powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we in the West hate to lose the most is our power.
Absolutely. And to talk about these things a little bit, it's one thing to argue, are they necessary or are they not? You can have that argument all day long. We're free to have that argument. And my argument may go one way one day and one way the next. Just depends on what I've been watching and who I've been listening to. That's fine. It's different when we try to refuse what our government has asked us to do. And for the reason they've asked us to do it. Because let's be clear, whether there's some other conspiracy or other thing going on, that's aside. What we have been told, what we have been asked is, for the protection of your fellow citizens, wear these things for the time being. Okay. Whether I agree with them or not, that's not a request I can deny. As a Christian who's told to obey their government, I can't deny doing something that at least the government claims this is for the well-being of the people around you. Now understand, for me, these things are as annoying as they can be. For some stupid reason, I chose to grow out my beard just as these came into style. Which means every time I put one on, I look like something, because it goes every direction, and it's a fight between my beard and these things because neither one wants to give. So I don't like them, but I'm going to do what the government asked me to do. Not because I necessarily agree with the government. I seldom agree with our government. But because they're the ones who sit in the king's position. And obedience to power is part of my responsibility as a Christian. Remember, even with the Pharisees, Jesus laid this principle out. When he told people, because they set themselves in Moses' seat, do as they tell you to do, just don't do how they do. He basically said, follow their instructions, don't follow their example. And technically, If you want to go the letter of Israelite law, the Pharisees had no power by the letter of the law, but they had gained power culturally. And for Jesus, that was enough. He said, they're the ones who sit in Moses' seat. Obey them. And in obeying, in being obedient, we actually end up finding we have more influence. And that's what I think we as Christians have to stop and think about. Now, if I'm asked my opinion, like the government says, hey, what do you think about this? I'm an American, I'm free to give them that opinion. But as a Christian, I'm not free to rebel. They post the speed limit. I may think it's stupid. I'm not free to break it. I accidentally do sometimes, not going to lie. It is on accident. That's always my story, and I'm sticking to it. Actually, it is. Or whatever else, wearing a seatbelt, paying my taxes. Here's where I wish we weren't streaming our services. Another one that irritated me beyond all belief was when the health insurance penalty went into effect. I'm like, you're going to force me to buy insurance? And if I don't, you're going to penalize me thousands of dollars by the time it was over? I thought that was dead absolute wrong. But you know what I did every year? I paid my penalty. It was cheaper than buying insurance. When you're my age, yeah, I needed the insurance, but that was just ridiculous amount. 20% of my salary would have gone to insurance. I thought that was an immoral, unethical, terrible, no good law. But you know what? I followed it anyway. Because they're the government. They have that power. I also reserve the right not to vote for anybody who supported it. Actually, I never went back and checked. But I reserve that right. It does. It changes very quickly. And I think that, I'm glad you brought that back up because I meant to bring that in. Go ahead. Absolutely. And this is the thing. We all think we have the answers to whatever issues come up. I mean, I can sit down with anybody and we can solve the world's problems in 30 minutes or less, probably. The truth is we can't, right? We don't know the future. We don't know how all this works out. We don't know. Like right now, there's a lot of high-profile people getting slammed because of what they originally said about how COVID would work or this or that. Because as it started, nobody knew. Everybody was guessing. Here's what's going to happen. Truth is, we don't know. So, in context, be careful not to react thinking you know where something's going, because the truth is you don't. Because you end up on the wrong side of an issue. It's happened to all of us, hasn't it? I mean, I know I've had to renege in my life. Well, I think it's this way. 6 months later, I wish nobody heard me say that. But they always do. And somehow it gets written down. I don't know. Or it's on tape and in the cloud and on YouTube and everywhere else. Johnny?
Don't you think you're more godlike if you admit that you made a mistake and you change your...
Oh, absolutely.
For the sake of, I want to be right, I change.
Well, I will say we're more godly. It's hard to say we're godlike because he never makes a mistake. But when we admit our mistakes and change, we definitely become more godly. Absolutely. Learn from them from the future. You know, have you ever thought, and we'll start wrapping up. I know I'm getting close to time here. One of the hardest things for us as humans to do is admit when we're wrong. Why do you think that is? It's actually a really easy answer. It took me a long time to come to it. But once you get it, and it probably won't take you near as long as me to come to it. But there's a really easy answer why we can't admit we're wrong. We don't think we're wrong. Even after we start to realize it, we can't hardly admit it. It all goes back to ego and pride. You know, our ego and pride drive us to do the dumbest things. And yet, what is a Christian called to be repeatedly? Humble. In humility, we can't admit it. I once thought this, I was wrong, now it's this. And I reserve the right to admit I'm wrong later again. You know, I'm seldom wrong on an issue only once. I may be wrong multiple times before it's over. That's okay. As long as I'm not rebelling against the powers that be, and I'm not acting ungodly in the process. You know, come November, I'll vote. However my conscience directs me to vote at the time. Right now, I'll do what the government tells me to do, unless they tell me to violate what my Lord says. Then the government is out of luck, and I'll pay the penalty. I won't fight them. I have fellow ministers right now in Canada, of all places, who when they get up to preach on Sunday, if they read Romans chapter 1 in a public assembly, it is technically classified as a hate crime. And they can be prosecuted and they can be put in jail for it. I don't think any of the Canadian authorities have done it yet, but it is the way the law is written. And if America was to pass that kind of law, I'd still be reading Romans chapter 1 at some point in my preaching. Because then it becomes a one or the other. And if I got to choose, I'm going to choose God. If it's not a one or the other, if it's all the mundane stuff that actually doesn't matter, then let them say what they're going to say. I'll be obedient. I'll do the best I can, but I'm going to go put God first. And believe me, the day may be coming, we actually really do have to make hard choices. It's happened in the past. It'll happen in the future. All right, any other thoughts or comments? I'm not going to say we got deep because I'm not sure I can get deep, but we definitely got into it. All right, well, let's end with the word of prayer. And we will, Lord willing, pick up here next week. Don't forget, Bible classes for kids began this past Sunday. Everything seemed to go well. We're looking forward to next Sunday as well. We are working on some ways to provide even more seating in the auditorium. So if you were here this past Sunday and you saw that it was starting to fill up, that's an awesome problem we're having. We're going to deal with it, so don't let that stop you. Anyway, things are hopefully getting better. That's what we're going to keep praying for. So let's end with a prayer. Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for loving us. We thank you for your wisdom and your guidance. And Father, we ask you to give us your Spirit through this difficult time as our country and our communities, Father, fight with each other and tear at each other. Help us, Father, be beacons of peace, of hope, of calmness, of gentleness, of patience. Help us be the example of Jesus, Father, in this world. Help us stand up to protect the defenseless when we have that opportunity, but let us